Hello and welcome to the latest in the BIA's Brexit Readiness Guidance series. I'm joined today, my name is Michael Warren, I'm the BIA's Brexit lead. Hello, I'm joined today by Jim Ward. Hi Jim.
Hi.
Jim is the Brexit project lead at Boehringer Ingelheim and is here today to talk us through some of the nuts and bolts of the implications of Brexit for medicines regulation. So this is a topic which has come up a lot in discussions with companies in our sector over the last few weeks and months as we've been around and talked to people about getting ready for Brexit. So I'm delighted to be able to welcome Jim, who's going to share you the insights of a huge amount of work that he's done on behalf of BI on this. Yeah, it's going to be exciting. I think we're going to go for about 20 minutes or so, and here's what we're going to cover. So I'll just start with a bit of context about the program as a whole, Jim, and then as our expert, I'm going to ask you a series of hopefully not too tricky questions about what regulation looks like in the new world of Brexit. So first of all, we're going to go through what might be the implications for no deal overall in terms of regulations, and we're going to chew over what the Office for Life Sciences, the government's official guidance on this looks like, which we're going to put up on screen. Those of you who follow this series of broadcasts will know that we had a member of the Office for Life Sciences team, Anisha Panjwani, come in and talk through this in great detail. So I'd really recommend, if you haven't already, to look up that broadcast in our series on YouTube or on our Brexit portal website to get the lowdown on the absolute accurate information from the government on how to prepare. What we're going to do today is skip through it though and get your take on it, Jim. I'm going to ask you about what you think businesses out there, maybe some of the businesses listening to this broadcast, should really be thinking about at this stage. We're literally 2 weeks to the day away from the first day potentially of a no-deal Brexit, depending on what happens over the next 2 weeks. So it'd be great to see what wise words of advice you have for people listening to this. Of course, we've potentially got a deal now, which has been signed off by the EU, but may or may not get signed off in the UK Parliament. So we're just going to spend a little bit of time thinking about what that might mean, and more broadly, what the implications could be, deal or no deal, in terms of longer-term planning for our sector, which is something that you've got some really interesting thoughts on. So that's what we're going to do. Let's dive straight in. So Brexit and life sciences regulation is the topic. We're going to focus today pretty much on medicines, aren't we, Jim? Because that's your area of expertise. I just note that the government guidance on this also includes details on medical devices as well. So if you want to check out that information, as I say, go back to our previous podcast, which we put out with Anisha Panjwani. Okay, good. Here's what the implications of no deal are for regulation according to the Office for Life Sciences and the government. So let's have a look at this. The way we're going to play this is I'm going to do probably an okay job of trying to read out what's on the slide, Jim, and you're going to tell me what you think about it. So the first point really relates to licensing, doesn't it? So this is just talking about how what currently happens to medicines in the UK or the UK market will kind of go into two parallel tracks in terms of UK registrations through MHRA and what assessment procedures will be put in place in order to make that happen. So we were talking earlier about this point about baseline data. Do you want to expand on that for people listening?
So the issue with the baseline data is 1 year is quite a generous amount of time to provide your baseline data. The issue is that most drugs, many drugs that are on the market, will actually need to have an update more frequently than once a year. And to do that update, you probably will need to hand your baseline data in for the request for the safety update. As such, what you really should do at this stage is look at the drugs that you have in your portfolio and identify how many updates that you've had over the previous few years, and you'll be able to find the drugs that go through frequent safety updates as opposed to drugs that maybe go through less frequent safety updates. And for the ones that go through frequent safety updates, you should try and do the baseline data a little bit early. So for example, if you have a drug that's going to go through 4 updates next year, or in the last year, you probably want to look at being ready to provide the baseline data in, say, 12 or 16 weeks post no deal.
Okay, so that's interesting. But I mean, the broad point is, it looks like the government are making this reasonably straightforward because they're converting the UK authorizations, the EU authorizations into UK ones.
Yes.
So that's going to be done automatically, as we understand it.
That's going to be done automatically. So in fact, that part is pretty straightforward. On day zero, companies shouldn't face immediate issues because not only are the licensing going to come across as you described, but they have time to implement the hard changes like providing the baseline data and updating the packaging. So on the very first weeks or months, this won't be an issue. The actual packaging and regulations won't be the issue that you're struggling to deal with. What you really need to think about outside of this is like, can you actually get the materials into the market, which is all the YORI numbers and TSP stuff. But this wouldn't necessarily be the area that would be concerned about initially. There's enough flexibility in there, probably more flexibility than you initially need for the first month or years.
Yeah, and what do we think about these new assessment procedures? So, I mean, there's kind of been interesting reactions to this across the industry, haven't they? I mean, this is done with a view to kind of, I mean, it's positioned as an improvement, I guess.
It could be an improvement. I think what you need to do is take advice from an IP lawyer to understand how these assessments would impact things like your time clocks in the US and across the EU, how it might impact things like pricing, parallel trade, things of this nature. So I think there's a lot more. They've given industry a lot of options on what they can do in the UK. Whether you want to utilize those options is something that you need to talk to people in your IP department and your pricing department to understand if they're beneficial to you.
Okay, very good. Thank you. That's good advice. So let's move on to responsible persons. So, I mean, look, for marketing authorization holders, you know, we're going to establish. It says these need to be established by the end of 2020, which on the face of it sounds like quite a generous deadline to set up something new. But is that enough time? I mean, in real world terms, how's that going to go down amongst manufacturers and license holders?
Well, establishing in the UK isn't the hard part of this particular thing. I mean, you can establish in the UK fairly rapidly. The harder part is the people part, and so the people part is the second bullet point there, the qualified person for pharmacovigilance. There isn't that many of them. We're looking at basically creating a whole entire new crop of them. So right now, if you have, for example, 100 needed across the EU, you now need 200, and that could be quite difficult for companies to pull together over the course of a very short period of time. So when you look at this, I wouldn't worry about the marketing authorization holder. There's many options around this. I'd be looking at the QPPV.
Yeah. So when you say look at it, I mean,
yeah.
Can we kind of turn that into some sort of, I don't know, let's think, imagine, you know, we're advising someone and this, what would you say? I mean, so it's going to be challenging.
It'll be challenging.
Are there any ways around that?
So first you have to decide if this is the right choice for you. As a company. So if you're a small business, let's say you're a US business, you have one pipeline drug, do you think that having your own QPPV in the UK for what will probably be less than 5% of your global turnover and certainly less than 5% of your profits is the right way to go? One choice would be just not to launch a drug in the UK. That probably isn't the world's greatest choice, right? The other choice would be to find a partner that has all that infrastructure. I think the companies that are actually going to be really well positioned, not thinking in the first few weeks or something like that, because there's a lot of leeway for the first few weeks. I think it's the companies that have pipeline drugs or short portfolios, looking at, you know, how do they address the UK market? Do they build their own infrastructure? Or do they consider other options?
Yeah. Okay. Very good. Should we move on?
Mm-hmm.
Something we've talked about a lot. Packaging.
Yeah.
You know, so I know you've had a lot of discussion and experience of working through this issue at Boehringer. So, you know, some things are going to change, but we've got a grace period again to the end of 2021 on many of these details.
Yeah.
But it's not something that can be done quickly, is it?
Yeah. So this is one where small companies are in better position than large companies. So small companies setting up let's say you have one drug, redoing the packaging for one drug. This is quite an achievable thing. What bigger companies will find is that they're really good at, really well set up to launch one drug globally in all the different markets, once a year or once every 3 or 4 years. What you're not really doing that. What you're doing is you're relaunching your entire portfolio in one country on one day. And what ends up happening is the systems aren't set up to do that way. You're basically asking a system to do something that's not designed to do. It depends on how your business is set up, your ERP system, your packaging system, your demand planning system, all these things. But for companies with a large portfolio of drugs, especially a large history, this will prove challenging. And the challenge really will be saying 2021, how do I work backwards from 2021 and figure out what different steps that I need to do today to be prepared for this? I think that there is a benefit to this, which is that if you start working backwards on this, I think a bunch of companies will have joint packs with Ireland specifically, but maybe other joint packs. When you start looking at the packaging things, what you'll probably find is you can make a decision on splitting those packs, and then that makes the FMD issues a lot easier to handle over time, because they're kind of joined together. Having the portfolio and the FMD together makes this actually, for bigger companies, a more complicated issue. But for small companies, I think this is actually quite achievable.
Yeah. Okay, very good. Let's keep going. Batch testing and release. So this has come up a number of times in the discussions we've had around the country with businesses in our sector. So, I mean, the rules say, or the government's saying, MHRA will basically continue to accept batch testing. So anything kind of coming in here shouldn't be a problem. Of course, the issue is going in the other direction, right?
That's right. That's right. So the UK has taken a much more lenient view on this. This view really only was solidified in 2019. So I think there was a lot of angst prior to it really being written down on paper the way that it is. The EMA has been much more straightforward. They had the rules put together probably as early as August 2000. Well, the rules have always been the rules, but they made the rules very, what the implications of the rules very clear in their Q&As and around August 2017 in some meetings. And they said they were going to enforce those rules. And as such, if you're doing UK-based testing, even if your drug is going to be used in the UK, you really need to move it to the EU. Because if you move it to the EU, you get the benefits of what the the UK government is offering here. You still get to bring it into the UK. You still get to use it inside the UK. But you also then can use it across all of Europe.
How realistic is that for some sort of, some of the businesses of the size that our membership and, the sector as a whole represents?
So I don't think it's the size of your businesses. I think it's the complexities of the drugs that they're working on. I think some of your companies which are making on small molecule drugs, which isn't a large part of the biotech industry. Most of them are working in large molecule, but small molecule drugs. Yeah, I mean, setting up an HPLC, GC in Europe, it's not impossible. If you're doing cell and gene therapy, if you're doing a biotech drug where you're doing, say, mouse models for testing, this is a real challenge, right? And moving this would take, certainly if you haven't started now, and we have no deal, these could be, you would struggle to get it done now. So it really depends on the complexity of the molecules you're looking at. Generics companies that have a large portfolio of small molecules, actually, you were saying, oh, it's a big company. They're in a particularly easy position because it's just HPLC, it's chemical physical testing.
So of course the EU, they could change their mind and they could accept batch testing and release done in the UK. I mean, is there any likelihood that they might shift on that? I mean, it's not something the government could comment on, but we can take a guess. I mean, I think we think that maybe it's unlikely, don't we?
They've been very clear that they're going to take a very hard view on this. I think pragmatically, you'll find that there are some drugs that you cannot move this. And the question that you really then have to ask yourself is that if you're the EMA, are you going to really, for drugs where companies can't do it because for technical reasons, they cannot move this thing, are you really going to have it such that your patients in the EU don't have access to that drug? I think that the pragmatism will come, but I think that if you have any opportunity to move it, and they look at the technical details and you haven't, then no, they're not going to do it. So if you have an HPLC test and you say, we really can't move it, I think these guys are quite clever and they'll look at it and they'll say, yeah, you really can, and you really should have. And I think there could be implications to that.
Okay, good. The last slide in this section of the government's advice is on clinical trials. And again, this is an area where there's quite a lot of uncertainty, I think. We've had a lot of questions on how trials could operate in a no-deal scenario. I mean, again, you know, the government's pretty clear about how it's going to work here, I think. The question again comes down to the uncertainty about, you know, stuff that happens partly in the UK, partly in the EU at present, and maybe partly in third countries.
Well, and I think you hit the nail on the head. It happens in third countries already, right? So clinical trials happen in the US all the time. There's when you're going to look for treatment-naive patients, you clearly are going to often go to third countries outside the EU or the US. So these things happen. The rules are fairly clear. The EU rules are fairly clear. I think the UK rules are more lenient than the EU rules, but the EU rules haven't. All of the UK has become is, from the EU standpoint, like a treatment-naive place. So if you wanted to go and look for treatment-naive patients in Vietnam, or you wanted to run a test because you have you need unique testing in the US, the UK just becomes that type of complexity. It's a known thing. I think that most companies know how to deal with that. I think that the UK is actually taking a broader view, so there's more flexibility in the UK. So that's a good thing. But yeah, the rules in the UK are no different than they would be for other third countries.
Yeah. Okay, very good. So that's the government's kind of top line advice on how to deal or what's going to happen if we have a no-deal Brexit, which of course we might not, but we might. So that's the purpose of this series of broadcasts. So let's kind of try and hone it down a little bit. So so we've looked at how it might work in a no-deal scenario, but I mean, we talked earlier about, you know, if you're looking at this as a business producing medicines currently in the UK, what do we think are the main points of concern, kind of wrapping that all up together? What do you think? I don't know, can I force you to kind of pick a top three, a big three?
I think what surprises me from the meeting that we had last night was the concerns around people. So I would say that the people risk is higher than it should be. So I think that companies should meet people where they are and be very clear about what the people risks are. The government has changed the documentation around people quite substantially, and I think that creates maybe even an undue amount of worry. So I think being clear to people what the rules are in the UK, what the rules are in the EU, would be beneficial. I think also putting in context for your employees is going to be important. There's more immigration from outside the EU into the UK than there is from the EU into the UK. All the UK is going to be doing is turning everything from outside the EU. So in those rules that work for Canadians and Australians, they're going to be the same rules that they have for French people. So I think that there will be paths forward. It isn't a light switch. So I think the first thing you want to do, because I mean, almost life sciences is an intellectual capital business. So the first thing you want to do is make sure the thing that drives your business, which is your employees, have a realistic understanding of what's happening on this. And even though things have changed, it isn't a disaster scenario. That said, things have changed, and you would want to also point out to them that why not? What is your no regrets around that? So if you already have settled status, there's nothing, right? You have settled status, that's fine. If you don't have settled status, I don't quite understand why you wouldn't want to use the EU settlement scheme today and try to do it before the 31st of October. It would provide you the documentation that you have that you were in the country at the time, and it isn't particularly difficult or hard. It's not costly. And it's pretty quick. So I would say going to your employees and explaining to them that, hey, listen, if you have settled status, don't worry, nothing's changed. If you don't, why don't you do this step? It's up to you, and I don't think that employers should push people to do something they don't want to do. But explain to them the benefits of being able to show that documentation.
On the regulatory side,
go on.
On the regulatory side, you know, we've only got 2 weeks to go. I don't know whether we think that there are any businesses out there in this field who haven't really done a huge amount to prepare from a regulatory point of view. I mean, what's facing those guys at this stage? If some people are listening thinking, well, we haven't really, you know, we're involved in running trials or, you know, developing new therapies or treatments or whatever. We haven't done much on this. I mean, where do they stand with 2 weeks to go potentially?
If they haven't done anything, then the first thing that they want to do is if they have reference member state, and they shouldn't, because the EU has gone out to countries where their RMS was inside the UK. They need to move it outside the UK. It's an administrative procedure. It isn't particularly difficult to do and fairly quick. The other thing is that they really haven't done anything, and I would doubt that there's anyone on this call that's in this situation. If you have your market authorizations inside the UK, you need to move them outside the UK now. There's no downside to having a market authorization in Germany. You will still be able to sell into the UK. But if you have your marketing authorization in the UK and it falls out, you won't be able to sell in Germany. And so this is a no regrets decision. I actually don't worry. So I would think that those big chunks are actually taken in place. What would worry me for somebody on this call is the boiling the frog issue. Some of these things have really long lead times. So we were talking about the 2021 thing. It could be for a company that has a large portfolio of drugs that the actual start date for transferring the portfolio could be days or weeks after a no deal, if you want to get the whole portfolio across those lines. I think the nice thing is that the government is engaging, and maybe these dates will change as they see pragmatically that it's hard for companies to do that. But right now, if you took it on face value, I think the companies need to be looking at where are they going to be in 12 months' time, and do they have enough time to get there? 12 months feels like a long way away, but for some of these changes, it really isn't. Mm-hmm. So those are the regulatory things I'd be worried about. But again, on day zero, it is RMSs, it's the marketing authorizations, but I would be deeply surprised if there was even what I call it an advocacy.
Okay, brilliant. So one of the things we've been talking about, of course, is imagine we do get a deal through. So those day one risks become less acute.
Yes.
But one thing we've been talking about is that, in a way, given that, you made the point very eloquently there already, some of these things do take a long time. Even in a deal scenario, that transitionary period that's written into the deal is actually not that long, is it?
No, and it's actually shorter than that. Transitionary period felt like it was longer when we were considering that, and it was agreed a couple years ago with Theresa May and things of that nature. They haven't changed the end dates really very much, and as such, you end up with a shorter and shorter transition period. I think there's a couple things that you have to worry about. I mean, we talked about the regulatory thing. I think the other thing that you have to, and we talked about the people thing. The other thing you have to look at is your fee structure, right? So you have to go in and say, what is the UK going to be doing regulatory-wise? I have a variation that I have to process for safety issues. Well, you're going to have to process it in the US. You're going to have to process it in the EU. You're not going to have to process it here, along with the fees for that, along with the person that's doing that. And what you're quickly going to see is that's going to add up pretty quickly. And I think companies need to start looking at, hey, what is my fee structure, and do I have enough capacity to do that? For some companies, it's just an increased amount of cost, which isn't a good thing. For other companies, it really will be. If you're a Boston-based biotech, wow, I mean, is that something I want to do? Right? And again, I think those companies will be thinking more strategically on what they can do to kind of reduce that fee structure somehow in the UK. I don't think that they're not going to launch in the UK. I just don't think that they'll do it by themselves.
Yeah. And in terms of the deal that's sort of been put forward, I mean, do we see anything in there that, that you think represents a significant challenge or hurdle, or maybe some things that are actually reassuring? So, I mean, it's broadly, in many ways, it's not so different from the previous deal in terms of the impact or the potential impact on what the government's aiming to negotiate with Europe from a regulatory point of view. I mean, clearly there are different provisions in there in relation to Northern Ireland, which represents, I suppose, a new and unique challenge for us. But what's your take on the kind of the substance of the deal as it sits? I mean, I know one thing that we've discussed a number of times, of course, is that in a sense the deal means little because it's really all down to now what gets negotiated about that future relationship.
Yeah, that's exactly right. So what you're really getting in this deal is a transition period, and a relatively short transition period, and you're getting a potential for an extension of a transition period. You should be using that time to assume potentially that you're going to have a no deal on the other side of it, because you don't have any idea. You don't have any idea who the government's going to be negotiating this thing in, let's say, 6 months' time. I don't think that many people could accurately tell you who the prime minister is going to be in April of next year, for example. That's the person that's going to be determining what really happens. So all you're getting is right now is, from a legal standpoint, is time to implement things. You're not getting a good understanding of what your future relationship is going to be. let's take an example that would be useful. So what is the relationship of this industry with the EMA, right? If they end up really becoming what they call an associate member status, which they've changed the terms of inside of that, all of a sudden you're going to see your fee structure in the UK go down, because you're not going to have to do unique things for the MHRA. You potentially aren't going to need this QPPV. You can see all sorts of things that are complexities disappearing, right? If the UK diverges hugely, you're not going to be able to have joint packs. You are going to need a QPP. Your fee structure is probably going to go up. Is either one of those options possible with the deal that's on the table today? Both of them are possible. Which one is going to happen? No one knows.
Yeah. And the point is, we probably won't know until, again, quite close to the next deadline, which is the end of the transition period.
Right. And so there's two ways to run these projects. One way to run these projects is to be sort of a betting person and try and find different scenarios that you could bet against and do things of that nature. I would worry that that is not the way to go. If you have parts of these things that, for example, would be hard to implement. Let's go back to the packaging. If you've come to the conclusion that updating your packaging is going to take 8 months, right? You should really look at 8 months before the due date. Let's plan for no deal. You can do all of your making bets and things of this nature up to 8 months beforehand. But once you get into that critical period, you then just need to implement on the basis of, I don't know what the future will look like. Because it's just the costs are too high. I mean, most of these companies have drugs that are far too valuable, both to patients and the companies and shareholders and employees, to really bet in a way like with this much uncertainty.
Okay, so let's just bring it to a conclusion then. I mean, so thanks very much, Jim. But I mean, just a sort of a final thought. I mean, would we be right, therefore, on that basis to say you may as well just get going with it now? Let's follow the government's advice, plan for no deal, because that's where we could end up anyway.
I think it's really worthwhile to do that planning. I especially think it's worthwhile to start doing the budgeting for it, so you can consider the various options. I think it's like it's anything, like a household budget. You want to go and buy a house, and then all of a sudden you realize you have to buy a car, and then you have to buy insurance, and something. You probably end up buying a different house if you actually plan all of those things out. So you might you might buy a slightly smaller house so that you can afford the car, that you can afford the insurance. If you go out and just buy the house and don't take into account the furniture that you're buying, then you buy the wrong house, and then you end up in the difficulties of, I can't pay for it, I'm not happy. The companies that go out and do their budgeting now, do their planning now, it might seem wasted, but what you end up doing is you know the business that you're going to be running in the future. Even if you don't end up having that business, you don't start building things that you didn't want to build. You don't start doing things you didn't want to do. So I'm not saying that you have to implement these things, but you should definitely have an idea of where you're going to be in, let's say, 2023 under a no deal. And I think that's what companies will do. And ultimately, half the population thinks this is a good thing, half the population thinks it's a bad thing. It's hard to think that both of them are wrong. There's going to be goods and bads on either side of this thing. I think the people that sit down and start looking at the details will be both surprised that things aren't going as easy as they hoped, and I think they also will find things that are better, and I think they'll be surprised that there are good things in this as well.
So just finally, I'll recommend to everyone, if you haven't already, please do go and check out the information provided by the MHRA on gov.uk, which sets out all of the implications of no deal in terms of regulations. The best place to find that is via the regulation and IP page of the BIA's Brexit portal. We've got it up on screen at the moment. So that's biabrexit.org/regulation. There you'll find all the links to the relevant and latest information.